My name is Niki Grangruth, and I am one of the artists of Muse. My background is generally in photography. My undergraduate was in studio art in general. My photographic practice tends to involve a lot of setup. It's very highly constructed. I don't consider myself a documentary photographer. So the work that James and I have been doing together is very much in line with other work that I've done as a photographer. I grew up in Minnesota. I moved to Chicago for graduate school. James and I attended the same graduate school, not at the same time, but we met through a coworker there. And then I received my MFA in photography from Columbia College. And James and I have been working together since 2009. I guess this project has ended, so it was over the course of 13, 14 years. Is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah.
And we both have our own artistic practices too. I do some photographic work along with some work in textiles and fabric art too.
And I'm James Kinser. I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I'm originally from Kansas, and my undergraduate degree is in ceramics and painting. And then my graduate degree is in interdisciplinary art, which really incorporated a lot of modalities. So performance, movement, spoken word, and visual art all together. And so what's really fun to see is how both of those educational experiences are combined into the work in Muse as well. So, Nikki, do you want to talk a little bit more about where this all started?
Sure. So I mentioned that James and I were connected through a coworker and friend, and that was in 2009. And at that point, James was doing a personal project where he was in drag and needed a photographer to document that process or document the images. And so we got together to work on James' project, which didn't it didn't go the way you wanted it to, I guess is one way to say it, which often things don't in art. But we realized that we had a strong connection and similar interests in ideas of gender performance and art history. And so we started by looking through art history books and looking at images that resonated with both of us. Previous to that, I had been working on a project that was about contemporary motherhood, and I was using images of the Madonna and Child as reference, so historical images. So this was kind of a natural segue into the work that James and I were doing. And we found that the images that resonated with both of us were almost always the same.
Yeah, so like half of those I think that we selected were identical and really became the nucleus for the Muse project. So we started out like uh working in my apartment. I think that was where our first shoot was. And I think we learned a lot from that how to collaborate together, what worked and what didn't. And I think one of the most important lessons from that initial shoot was that there was a large mirror in the background that was reflecting my kitchen, which we didn't really think about at the time. And, it just became much more clear that we had to think about what the set was and what was appearing in it as we were creating these images.
So the first image was a bar at the Falaise Bergère. You pronounce it better than I do. Um, and that attempt, it's not the one that's in the exhibition. Our first attempt was really rough. It was initially when we started working together, we were still getting to know each other. And so we ended up recreating that image later in a much more refined way. But that image, as James said, gave us a lot of insight as to where we wanted to go with this project. So we started with some of the, I guess you could say, simpler images. Interestingly enough, we started with a lot of the nudes. And at this point, James and I were just getting to know each other. So there was, like no holds barred there. And we were working in my apartment, constructing the sets out of fabric and materials that we had on hand. And I really think that as we've gone along, we've attempted to do more sophisticated pictures just in the amount of detail and construction that's involved, both in the sets and the costumes, which James can talk about in more detail. But I think that those early pictures, which were the girl with the pearl earring, Odalisque, the
Olympia.
bather, Olympia, um, really kind of set us on a path for what would come next.
Yeah, and I think it is really interesting to see the more simple um, backgrounds of those versus the more complex backgrounds of something like the dream or the Annunciation, which we'll talk about here in a minute.
Should we talk about our collaborative process a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's important to share that the collaborative process is very much 50-50 and not a traditional um me as subject, you as photographer. Like it's a collaboration from the very start. And we mentioned those initial images at the very beginning, and so we sat down with those and kind of thought about how could we construct those from a set standpoint, but then also from a costume standpoint. So we're we're collaborating at that idea stage. And then as I would be working on the development of costumes, I was consistently checking in with Nikki and saying, "Hey, is this feeling right?" Or if I had a specific question about the fit or something like that. But it was always nice to have that other person to rely on and get feedback from. And then, do you want to talk about collaboration when it comes to the actual shoot?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'll preface with about collaboration is that there's a lot of benefit to collaboration. We come up against some challenges, not necessarily with each other, but just how the work is seen. I think that when we're showing it in the photography world, I'm often attributed to be the artist, and when we're showing it in the more interdisciplinary way, James is considered the main artist. So we come up against those challenges and often have to explain that really we are both authors of this project. Because we start with the initial ideas, then we tend to go each way to plan out. So James will plan out the costume. I think generally James started planning out the sets, and that became more of a collaborative effort as we went along. And then I would study the images and think about how to recreate the look of a painting in a photograph. So planning out things like lighting, um, distance from the background, those sort of things. And the day of the shoot is, I feel like there is a very special energy that is there because we have such a connection as artistic partners. That's very different than just my experience photographing someone for a portrait that was my own. So I think that James starts to see himself through the eyes of the photographer, and I start to see the image through the eyes of James too. And I think all along that point, I think we're always looking at the viewer or determining the viewer to be a participant in our work as well. We are always considering kind of the gaze upon this image and what the viewer is going to take out of it. But um, with the day of the shoot, James is usually getting ready, putting on makeup, getting in costume. I'm setting up lighting, and then we work together to get the posing. And there's often this moment for us where we both know that we've gotten it. Something comes together and clicks for us. We try to make James as active subject as possible in the images, even if he's not engaging directly with the camera. So it could be something like just a tilt of a head or eye contact. And then we review the images, and generally it is that one that we determined that is the winner for us. Some of the works are constructed from multiple images and have some post-production that take place, but it's not a lot of them. So generally then from there, it's editing, which we look at images together, think about the editing process. So all along the way, it's a very collaborative effort.
I think a really great example of that, knowing that you've gotten the shot, is the Annunciation, because we had shot the Virgin Mary, or no, sorry, yes, we shot Mary first, and then the angel Gabriel second, and it was a really uncomfortable pose, and I remember just sort of like breathing through the discomfort, and then having a moment of projecting myself into what the angel Gabriel in that moment would have been giving to Mary. And I was imagining Mary standing in front of me and just projecting this love out to her. And so there's this very like this energetic flow that I think that I learned to tap into through my performative work, that really helps us find that perfect moment where we find the shot.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think another example of that was when we were shooting Whistler too. So Whistler had a unique setup for us because we were doing a residency at the time, and we actually built the set in the gallery that it was going to be shown to give the viewers of our exhibition kind of an inside peek as to what went into the set construction as well. Um, there's also funny moments that happen within that, but I think that there's just that one particular movement or positioning that it really all comes together.
Mhm. Well, speaking of funny moments, shall I tell the story of Venus?
Yeah.
So, so for the birth of Venus, that was one of our early shoots, and my friend Joe and I had built this gigantic 6 foot by 9 foot um, clamshell in my apartment dining room, and at 4:45 in the morning, we hauled this thing to the beach in Chicago. And when we got to the beach, we were completely surprised to see that the parking lot was totally full. There was a line of school buses that were parked, and we were very confused. And I was already made up at that point, so we're like, we're just gonna do this. And so we hauled the shell down to the beach, and as we're setting up, we start to see people stretching and they're in like running gear. So we kind of figured out that there was like a 20-mile fun run that was happening at that time. But I think that the runners were equally confused as well, because here I am practically naked and there's this giant shell and photographer set up, and we're getting ready to shoot. And in the moment that Nikki is about to click for the first time, the over the loudspeaker, the national anthem starts playing. And we just lose it. It's just we're in laughing hysterics in that moment, and I think that probably every shoot that we've had together, there's been a moment where we've just had to pause because something has tickled us and and made us laugh. So it's not all serious work.
Yeah. I think that that also is, it makes it fun to work with someone else. I think that artistic practice can often be an isolating experience. And so working with someone else makes it more interesting and more fun. Um, should we talk about some of the post-production? Because I think that leads into kind of what it means to recreate a painting.
Yeah, for sure.
So with Venus, which is probably one of my favorite images just because of the backstory to it, I wanted to salute James when the national anthem was playing as he's nude and blow his uh, scarf is blowing in the wind. But one thing that we learned through that image is the difficulty that sometimes occurs in recreating a painting. So I think it's important to us that we're recreating the paintings as a reinterpretation and putting our own ideas into it. But there's a lot of times where we really carefully want to recreate the aesthetic of the painting. So one of the things that we ran into in the Venus shoot was that we were photographing towards Lake Michigan in Chicago, and the sun was rising. And we photographed over a period of time, and the lighting wasn't exactly right in what we wanted in the sky. So we actually ended up combining images. I think there's three separate images. There's one of James, there's one of the water, and then there's one of the sky as well. And so we take those liberties to try to match the aesthetic of the original paintings that we're looking at. So Venus is kind of a lower level example of that, but there's some examples where we use a lot more post-production. James already mentioned Annunciation, but he appears twice in that image. So that obviously has to be a composite image, but also we had a difficult time finding a location that fit the background that we envisioned for that painting. So there was a lot of piecing together of different parts of images, of putting James into the background that was created. So the Annunciation and then the Dream, which is kind of my nightmare one. um, the Dream is, I think, over 40 hours of post-production because we photographed in the Garfield Park Conservatory, which is a gorgeous conservatory in Chicago. For the background, James was shot in studio, and then a lot of the plants in the foreground was they were photographed on their own.
Can I
And to
just
get
jump in
that,
and say that in
yeah.
studio means that it's a green screen taped to my apartment
Yeah.
living room?
As someone who teaches photography as well, I think it's important to address that things do not have to be fancy. And often what you're seeing outside of the frame is not fancy at all. A lot of duct tape and yeah, so that's a good point. Um, but I think with the Dream, there's a flatness to that image that we wanted to recreate, which is actually more difficult than what it would appear. And I started over on that a couple of times. So in some of them, the post-production is pretty intense, at least in some of the later works.
Yeah, and then well, you were talking about the set building, and so those were the ones you just talked about were ones that were really complex backgrounds for post-production. But I think that the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, that's one where we actually painted the backdrop of that set, and so there was a lot of work that happened in advance of the shoot. And then we turned that backdrop around and then painted it for, I'm trying to think, the
This is George
mayonnaise.
Swinton.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So, and the other thing that I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about costumes is I think there's a sensibility for understanding light and color that came from my understanding of painting from undergrad. And I was able to really find fabrics that could replicate that kind of modulation of light that often happens in many of those paintings. But Nikki, I think that as we were talking about the art historical element, um, I think we have to talk about the importance of that in the work, that the reinterpretation of it has a very specific purpose, and that purpose is that it's a very easy entry point for people to begin experiencing the work. So, for example, Girl with the Pearl Earring is very recognizable, and so somebody can come up to that image and begin to engage with it. Whereas I think that some of the reclining nude images, it can be confrontational, first of all, for people who aren't comfortable with naked bodies. But then second of all, seeing um, a masculine man shaped in a very feminine way, I think can also be something that's very confrontational for people. So, so it's
Yeah, and I think
important
that
for
that
us
was,
to have that entry point.
yeah. And I think especially when we think back to when we started working, this was in 2009, and the acceptance and non-acceptance of gender play and gender performance has gone through a roller coaster, basically. And I think one thing that often gets mentioned is that this is when RuPaul's Drag Race came out, and there was more of an entry point for folks who may have not been familiar with ideas of gender performance. But we've had people in the past sort of not realize what's happening in the work right away because it's a, a reinterpretation of something that's already familiar. And then there's the element of surprise when they get closer that, yeah, this is a man. And um, I think that some people engage with that, and then it makes some people uncomfortable. And we've had people express that to us before. But I think that that's where the art history becomes really powerful, because I think we're always dealing as a society with this like cyclical nature of images and beauty standards and what what starts to reappear in our lives. And I really feel like that becomes an important element in our work as well.
Yeah, and the moment I think we had a couple of pieces at a show at the Kinsey Institute, and there was a gentleman who walked up to one of the pieces and said, "Oh, this is really beautiful, but I'm straight."
Yeah.
So
They're always it's funny things that people kind of say about it.
yeah,
I think along with the idea of using art history as a reference point and an entry point into the images is the role of the muse too. That is important with us. Is all of the painting or all of the images that we have reinterpreted except one are a male artist painting a female or depicting a female subject. And so, in a lot of ways, we're reversing that, not just entirely reversing it, but kind of confusing that entire relationship intentionally. But one of the things that we recognized pretty early on that was really important to us is James in the role of a muse being an empowered muse rather than a passive muse. And I think that there's a few ways that we do that. One is just his being a collaborative process and having James as a subject also being an author of each of the works. And another way is in the gaze. So we Gaze, not Gayz. um, but that engagement with the camera and therefore an engagement with the viewer that comes into play, which can sometimes be confrontational, even in works that where the subject isn't directly looking out at the viewer. We use other things to have to reference James being an active part of that, like a lift of the chin or a look of confidence or a little bit more of a dignified presence in the image. Because and that's where a lot of the reinterpretation comes in, at least from my perspective, is those subtle details and that shift from Muse as a passive participant to James as Muse as an active maker and participant in the images.
So, an additional element of that is the performative element, right? So I think it's easy to think that as the subject, I just sit there and take the picture. But what uh, what's often happening is that I'm contorting into weird positions. So physically, it's not always comfortable. But then also there's like kind of like I mentioned about the Annunciation shoot. There's a um, assuming of the persona of the subject that we're reinterpreting that occurs as well. And so there's that performative element. But then um, as a whole, I think we're also talking about gender as a performative act too. We reference Judith Butler, the gender theorist, often, who spoke about or wrote about how gender is a performative act, that how we walk, how we move, the gait of our step, the posture that we inhabit as we move are all signifying a specific gender. And so I think that we're often thinking about those signifiers as well. Like Nikki mentioned, like the tilt of the head or the height of the chin in the photo. Those are all signaling gender in some way. And so we think about that as the performative element of the work too.
Mhm. One thing I just thought about too, in the idea of gender and the reference point, the art history as a reference point into these pictures, is where we differ a lot from painting is I think the photograph is always has a history of being considered truthful and real, whereas when you look at painting, there's sort of a level of distance that's there because you don't have the subject directly in front of you. It's a likeness of the subject. It's been painted. It could have been manipulated. Where with James as a subject, he's really there, and I think that some folks find that um, there's a level of discomfort with that too. One of the things that I was just thinking about before this that I don't know if we've talked a lot about is how our process involves problem solving. I think that one of the things that connects us is that we look at creating artwork as a series of questions or problems to solve. Like, how do we recreate this background? How do we make James an active participant in this? How do we navigate those nuances of gender performance? How male does he appear? How female does he appear on that spectrum. And I think that both James and I are problem solving artists. Like we like to start with a problem, we like to start with questions and then figure out how to answer those. And this particular body of work has had a lot of problem solving elements in it related to logistics, concept, intent, all of that. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about like the gender roles, because I think that we both approach that from a different way.
Yeah.
Um, and how it relates to where we are in a contemporary context, because
Yep.
we addressed a little bit of how where we started in 2009, RuPaul's Drag Race was happening. There was still, James can probably speak to more about this, but there's been various levels of comfort with non-binary or gender performance. But also, I think that one thing James and I are always considering is that we both come from rural communities and we were working together in Chicago. I now live in a suburb of Minneapolis, but we we tend to be in more liberal accepting areas of things like gender performance, but keeping in mind that we also, our work has been shown in these rural communities and what that means for areas that might not be as accepting of this. And I think a lot of times I get a question about, like, well, I'm a cis straight woman. Like, what is my interest in this? And I think that I've always had an interest in how gender roles are portrayed. And this was evident in my previous work where I was photographing contemporary motherhood and kind of that like idealized mom or mother, but kind of mixing that with a more realistic version of that. So I think these like gender roles and standards have always been something that's really interesting to me. And I get to explore this with James, who navigates that in a much more personal way.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the personal roots go back a long ways because when I started making art, especially in college, I was reconciling being gay with my upbringing within a conservative Christian home, and and I had such a desire for these two conflicting things to be at peace with each other, and so over time, I think that my artistic practice has been about looking at polarities and bringing them together. And so when it came time for me to work on my graduate thesis, um, I had, as Nikki had mentioned, I developed a drag persona, and so through that persona, I was able to access levels of expression that I couldn't in my normal everyday life. And so it was a practice of inhabiting this persona with a wider range of self-expression and then being able to reincorporate what I learned from that experience into my everyday life. So that performance was impacting my real life. And I think that theme is um, consistent with my work now, and I think consistent with the Muse series, and more specifically the this work was important for me to make because I could see this very feminine part of myself that existed from childhood. And I wanted to give it space and I wanted to understand it from this 30 and 40-year-old perspective. Um, how can this young, effeminate, free-spirited uh, way of being be incorporated into my current existence? And what I think is interesting is that now that this his series has come to a close, I I feel less desire to I shouldn't say less desire. I'm actually the pendulum swings. So now I'm kind of exploring what is it like for me to inhabit masculinity. So I'm holding this experience and this history of understanding what it's like to embrace femininity and now like bringing those two polarities together, the masculine and the feminine. So it's just a lot of um, gender play, what however that is, whether it's masculine or feminine.
That idea of the pendulum swing too makes me think about how I can't remember. Maybe it was in like 2018 or so, we started to question the relevancy of the work because there seemed to be a general acceptance of ideas of gender performance and gender play and non-binary gender representation and this acceptance of gender being on a spectrum. And I think that the pendulum has swung the other way back to closer to where we started and maybe even past that with recent, legislature and those sort of things. So I think it just enhances that idea that these issues are still really relevant. I'm also curious on your perspective on that as someone that like inhabits more of that space in their life as
Yeah.
to like how that feels, how the moment feels right now, dealing with things like gender play and non-binary gender expression.
Well, I think there's a direct influence and connection between my shift toward exploring masculinity and what's happening in culture, and the fact that I moved out of Chicago to, I mean, it's a welcoming suburb of Chicago, but at the same time, um, I recognized that I felt a certain heightened level of self-consciousness if I were to wear more feminine clothing in my everyday life. Um, I'm pausing because I'm feeling an emotional upwelling, because I think anyone who inhabits uh, a non-binary gender space is concerned about safety. And um, I haven't always been safe in my life. I've been harassed and uh, if physically, um, uh, words are escaping me. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that um, I think that a lot of people in this space are thinking about how can I be who I truly am and how can I be safe? And so
Yeah.
my hope is that this work will in some way give someone the opportunity to see themselves and give them more license to freely express themselves and find safe space.
I mean, I think you just summed up what we're trying to do with the body of work. I think that it's really personally meaningful to both of us.
Well, thank you for this time together today. It's always a treat to collaborate with you.
Yeah, same.